In many wars, the most dangerous mistake a commander can make is assuming the enemy will behave exactly as expected. In September 1993, Croatian officers believed they understood the men standing across from them. The soldiers wore blue helmets and carried the flag of the United Nations. To those Croatian commanders, that symbol meant hesitation, diplomacy, and withdrawal. But in the Medak Pocket of Croatia, that assumption was about to collapse. The peacekeepers they were facing were Canadians, and they had already decided that watching another massacre was not an option. A confident warning. It was early afternoon, September 1993. The Medak Pocket sat under a dull gray sky, scarred by days of violence. Around midday, a Croatian captain spoke over the radio. His words were translated into English by a UN interpreter, but the tone behind them needed no translation. Calm, certain, almost contemptuous. The message was clear. You are peacekeepers. You will not shoot. You will turn around. The message was directed at Lieutenant Colonel James Calvin, commander of the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Roughly 700 Canadian soldiers from 2 PPCLI positioned along the ceasefire line, their weapons loaded, watching Croatian forces massed ahead of them. Those Croatian units numbered approximately 2,500 soldiers, including elements of the 9th Guards Brigade and Special Police formations. Over the previous 6 days, they had pushed through the Medak Pocket with brutal efficiency. Villages burned behind them, civilians disappeared. Later investigations and UN reporting would describe the operation as one of the most systematic instances of ethnic cleansing during the Croatian War of Independence. Serbian villages in the pocket were destroyed methodically. The number of civilians killed was never fully confirmed. Estimates varied, with some figures suggesting around 70 to 90, while other assessments believed the actual toll could be considerably higher. But Croatian commanders, by most accounts, believed none of that would matter, because they believed the United Nations would do nothing. The war already burning. By 1993, the Croatian War of Independence had been raging for more than 2 years. It began in 1991 when Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia, setting off a violent conflict between Croatian government forces and ethnic Serb communities who controlled significant portions of Croatian territory and had declared their own breakaway regions. The United Nations entered the conflict in early 1992, deploying peacekeepers across the region under a mandate to monitor ceasefires and protect designated zones. By 1993, tens of thousands of UN personnel from dozens of nations were spread across the former Yugoslav republics in various capacities. On paper, the mission carried considerable weight. In practice, its rules of engagement were extremely limited. Peacekeepers could use their weapons only in direct self-defense. Their role was to observe, report, and maintain a presence, not to fight. This created a pattern that armed factions throughout the region had learned to exploit. Whenever UN peacekeepers were challenged by force, the default response was typically to withdraw rather than escalate. Croatian commanders had watched this happen. Earlier in the conflict, Croatian units had moved against Serbian-held territory, while UN forces observed without intervening. The lesson those commanders drew was straightforward. Blue helmets were witnesses, not obstacles. Operation Medak. The Medak Pocket was a narrow strip of Serbian-held territory extending into Croatian-controlled land, a roughly triangular area of rugged hills, forests, and scattered villages. An estimated several hundred to several thousand Serbian civilians remained there, depending on the area and the timing of the operation. To Croatian military planners, the pocket represented both a tactical problem and a political opportunity. If it could be seized quickly and its villages destroyed, Serbian presence in the area could be eliminated before the UN had time to react. On the morning of September 9, 1993, the operation began. Croatian artillery opened fire across the pocket, striking defensive positions and civilian areas. Under the bombardment, infantry advanced behind armored vehicles. Canadian observation posts reported the attack immediately. It was clear this was no minor skirmish or localized provocation. It was a full-scale military assault. Serbian defenders attempted to resist. Many were poorly armed local militia, fighting from stone walls and tree lines with what they had. In at least one village, a small group held a crossroads for several hours before being overwhelmed. Their resistance could not stop the advance, but it allowed some civilians to escape into the surrounding forests. Meanwhile, Canadian commanders relayed the situation up the chain to UN headquarters. The response followed the pattern that had become grimly familiar across the Balkans: urgent consultations, diplomatic pressure, calls for an immediate ceasefire. On the ground, the destruction continued. By September 10th, several villages had fallen. Croatian Special Police conducted what their operational language described as mopping up operations. Behind that clinical phrase, UN observers and Canadian soldiers would later document executions, burned homes, and the systematic elimination of any evidence that the villages had ever been inhabited. Canadian soldiers could see the smoke rising from the hills. They could hear gunfire continuing long after organized resistance could have ended. They understood precisely what that meant. The standoff. Under sustained international pressure, Croatia agreed to a ceasefire to take effect at noon on September 15th. Under the terms of the agreement, Croatian forces were to withdraw and allow UN troops to enter the pocket and establish a buffer zone. That responsibility fell to the Canadians. Colonel Calvin understood exactly what the assignment required. His soldiers would have to advance into territory Croatian forces had just seized by force, territory those forces had no real intention of relinquishing without a test. On the morning of September 15th, Canadian armored vehicles moved forward toward the pocket. Smoke still drifted over the hills. Distant gunfire could be heard even though the ceasefire was supposed to be in effect. At the first checkpoints, Croatian troops allowed the Canadians through. Then they reached the main roadblock. The Croatian commander refused to move. Through a translator, he delivered essentially the same message that had come over the radio earlier. The Canadians would turn around. Colonel Calvin's response, according to accounts from soldiers present, was measured and direct. The United Nations had authority to enter the area. The Canadians were moving forward. Croatian forces could step aside, or they would be moved. The Croatian officer, by those same accounts, laughed. Moments later, Croatian soldiers opened fire. The 15 hours of fire. The initial firing was almost certainly intended as intimidation. Automatic bursts snapped over Canadian positions, a tactic used repeatedly throughout the Balkan conflicts to signal that peacekeepers should withdraw before anyone got seriously hurt. These peacekeepers did not withdraw. Canadian soldiers took cover and reported contact. The order came back through the radio: return fire. The engagement escalated quickly. Croatian machine guns opened sustained fire on Canadian armored vehicles. Canadian gunners responded with heavy .50 caliber weapons. Infantry dismounted and formed defensive positions along the road and into the forest edges on both sides. Mortars were brought into action from both sides. Anti-tank missile teams deployed against Croatian vehicles and fortified positions. For several hours, the fighting continued across the hills and tree lines of the Medak Pocket. The Canadians were outnumbered by a significant margin, roughly 3-1 by most estimates, but their training, cohesion, and leadership held. Colonel Calvin remained close to the forward positions, directing the battle while maintaining coordination with his officers across a fluid and dangerous front. As darkness fell, the fighting grew more disorienting. Tracer rounds crossed the night sky in both directions. Rocket-propelled grenades detonated in the tree line. The burning villages behind Croatian lines threw an orange glow across the hills that veterans would later say they never quite forgot, because peacekeepers were not supposed to fight like this. Nothing in the script for UN operations in the Balkans had prepared anyone, on either side, for what was happening in the Medak Pocket that night. A silent return. When soldiers come home from combat, nations have a way of marking the moment. Parades, ceremonies, names in the newspapers, a country acknowledging, in whatever way it can manage, that something was done and that it mattered. None of that waited for the soldiers of 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, when they returned home in the autumn of 1993. What waited for them was silence. No parade, no formal ceremony, no public acknowledgement of what they had done or what they had found in the Medak Pocket. Reports written by Colonel Calvin describing the firefight, the evidence of killings, and the systematic destruction his soldiers had documented were classified and filed away. It was as though the battle had never taken place. For the soldiers who had been there, that silence was bewildering and, for many, deeply painful. Corporal Scott LeBlanc later described it with characteristic bluntness. "It was like we'd gone on vacation," he said. "We came home, and nobody knew what had happened. Our families didn't know. The public didn't know. We had fought a battle, and it felt like nobody cared." The reasons were not difficult to reconstruct, even if they were hard to accept. Canada was actively trying to maintain workable diplomatic relations with Croatia. Most Western governments shared that priority, publicly documenting ethnic cleansing carried out by Croatian forces, forces that Western governments were, in various ways, aligned with against Serbian aggression elsewhere, was politically complicated, and acknowledging that Canadian peacekeepers had fought a sustained battle to stop it would have complicated things further still. Protecting an image. There was another layer beneath the politics. Canada's national identity, by the early 1990s, had become genuinely intertwined with the idea of peacekeeping. The blue helmet was not merely a military symbol, it had become part of how Canadians understood their place in the world. Mediators, bridge builders, the soldiers who kept the peace rather than fighting wars. A prolonged firefight in Croatia did not fit comfortably inside that self-image. It was easier to keep it quiet. The United Nations had its own reasons for discretion. Publicizing the clash risked provoking Croatian retaliation against other UN units in the region and potentially destabilizing negotiations that were fragile enough already. Stability in the institutional calculus of that moment outweighed transparency. Canada's newly elected Liberal government returned to power in late 1993 was focused on domestic economic pressures and national political questions. A complex, ambiguous military engagement in the Balkans, one that didn't fit any clean narrative, was not something they were in a hurry to explain to the Canadian public, so the silence held. A lesson not passed on. Despite everything that was suppressed, the battle had immediate and concrete effects on the ground. Croatian forces became measurably more cautious around Canadian positions after Medak Pocket. The message, delivered without ambiguity, had been received. These particular peacekeepers would fight back, and they had the equipment and training to make that costly. Word circulated among the various armed factions operating in the region. The blue helmet did not automatically mean a free pass. Croatian military planners quietly absorbed the lesson. When planning future operations, including the major Operation Storm Offensive in 1995, UN unit positions were mapped and factored into the planning in ways they had not been before. But the broader international community never heard the story, and the lesson that might have informed other missions went unshared. At nearly the same moment the Medak Pocket fighting was taking place, other peacekeeping missions were fracturing under their own contradictions. In October 1993, just weeks later, American forces in Mogadishu fought the engagement that became known as the Battle of Mogadishu. 18 U.S. soldiers were killed, and the images that followed, broadcast into living rooms across the world, accelerated an American withdrawal from Somalia that had already been losing political support. Then came Rwanda. In the spring of 1994, between 500,000 and 800,000 people were killed in roughly 100 days, while UN peacekeepers stood by under orders that prevented them from intervening to stop the slaughter. The mission commander, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, sent repeated requests to UN headquarters for authority to act. Those requests were denied. A year later, in Srebrenica, Dutch peacekeepers withdrew from positions under pressure from Serbian forces. Within days, more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were executed in the worst mass killing on European soil since the Second World War. In all of these catastrophes, peacekeepers faced a version of the same impossible choice: stand aside or fight. At Medak Pocket, the Canadians had chosen, and because their story was buried, the example was never available to the commanders and politicians who might have needed it most. And the cost of silence. Years later, some Croatian soldiers who had been present spoke about that day with a candor that the official record had long suppressed. One officer from a special police unit recalled the moment the Canadians returned fire. His unit had fully expected the peacekeepers to file their protests and pull back. That was how things worked. That was what experience had taught them to expect. When we fired at them, they fired back harder, he said, according to accounts collected by journalists and researchers in the years that followed. They had anti-tank weapons that could destroy our vehicles from long distance. We realized very quickly that they were not going to run. Another soldier, speaking years later, put it more plainly. They had thought they were dealing with peacekeepers. They had not expected anyone to actually fight. They were wrong. For nearly a decade, that remained a truth known only to the soldiers who had lived it and to the officials who had decided the world shouldn't hear about it. The veterans who had proved that peacekeepers could stop violence, if they were given the will and the authority to do so, were told, in effect, that their actions were too inconvenient to discuss. The cost of that silence is genuinely impossible to calculate. Whether different outcomes in Rwanda or Srebrenica would have followed if the Medak Pocket story had been told in 1993 is a question history cannot answer with certainty. What can be said is that the pattern of failed peacekeeping missions in the years that followed all shared the same central flaw: the assumption that peacekeepers could not or would not act. The Canadians at Medak Pocket had already proven otherwise. Nobody had been told. Recognition at last. Colonel James Calvin retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2001 after a long career that he spoke about publicly only with great restraint. Those who served under him needed no public record to remember what had been decided in the Medak Pocket. He explained his reasoning simply in the accounts he eventually gave. His soldiers could see the smoke. They could hear the gunfire. Asking them to stand there and do nothing would have made them complicit in whatever was happening behind that smoke. We had a choice, he said: step aside and let them finish, or intervene. For nearly a decade, Canada's official position was essentially to pretend the choice had never been made. Then, in 2002, the silence finally began to break. Investigative journalists and veterans pushed the story into public view. Canadian journalist Carol Off published her investigation, The Ghosts of Medak Pocket, bringing the events into national conversation for the first time. The reaction, once the story was out, made the years of suppression seem not only unjust, but genuinely difficult to defend. On December 2, 2002, 9 years after the battle, a ceremony was held in Ottawa. 19 soldiers from 2 PPCLI received individual medals for their actions. The entire battalion received the Commander-in-Chief Unit Commendation, among the highest honors available to a Canadian military unit. Governor General Adrienne Clarkson addressed the assembled veterans that day. Her words carried the particular weight of recognition that arrives late, but means something precisely because of how long it was withheld. "These soldiers did what soldiers are meant to do," she said. "They stood against evil, and they did not hesitate." For the men who had carried those memories in silence, who had come home to nothing, who had watched subsequent disasters unfold in other countries while their own story stayed classified, the recognition was overdue by nearly a decade, but it mattered. A choice remembered. Every September, veterans of the Medak Pocket gather at the Princess Patricia's Memorial in Edmonton. Time has done what time does. Many walk with canes now. Some arrive in wheelchairs. The hair that was dark in 1993 has gone gray, but they come back. They remember the villages that no longer exist. They remember the civilians they reached too late to save. And they remember the moment when the choice was placed directly in front of them, with no ambiguity about what it meant: step aside or fight. The Croatian commanders expected them to step aside. Every lesson that formation of peacekeepers had offered the region, every withdrawal, every protest filed and ignored, pointed toward the same outcome. These Canadians did not step aside. They advanced into a fight they had not been sent to fight, against a larger force, on ground they hadn't chosen, for people whose language they didn't speak, and whose villages they had never heard of before arriving in that corner of Croatia. They fought because the alternative was to become witnesses to something they couldn't witness and remain themselves. For the men who survived the Medak Pocket, that decision, made in a few seconds at a roadblock on a September afternoon, became the thing around which everything else in their lives eventually arranged itself. They made the right choice. It took the world 9 years to say so.